He was on one knee proposing with a ring in front of everyone. I walked in and said stop because that ring had my grandmother's name engraved inside and he told me it was lost. He was on one knee. The whole restaurant was watching. And the ring in that box, the one he was about to slide onto another woman's finger, had my grandmother's name engraved on the inside of it. I walked straight toward him. Let me tell you what nobody in that restaurant knew. Nobody knew that ring had sat in my dresser drawer for 6 years before I ever let another person touch it. Nobody knew my grandmother had given it to me specifically, not to my mother, not to any future husband, to me, because she said I was the only one in the family who understood that some objects carry love across time like a current running through them. Nobody knew I had placed it in Marcus's hands on a quiet night 14 months ago as the most serious thing I had ever done in a relationship. And nobody in that restaurant knew that 6 months after I gave it to him, Marcus sat across from me with tears in his eyes and told me the ring was lost. He was not crying about losing it. He was crying because he had already decided what he was going to do with it. I need you to sit with that for a second before I go any further. The man on one knee in that restaurant had looked me in the face and cried real tears over a ring he was holding in a drawer somewhere, already planning, already waiting, already building a future with someone else while I was still standing in the wreckage of the lie he had just handed me. That is not a mistake. That is not complicated. That is a person who looked at something sacred and decided it was useful. Marcus and I had been together for 3 years before I gave him that ring. 3 years of the kind of relationship that makes you stop being afraid of the future because the future finally has a shape you recognize. He was not flashy or dramatic. He was the kind of man who remembered the small things, what you ordered the first time you went somewhere together, what song was playing when you told him something that mattered, what your grandmother's laugh sounded like from the one video you showed him once. That quality of attention is rare. I mistook it for depth. What I did not understand was that a person can pay exquisite attention to you and still be capable of something that would hollow out everything that attention built. The ring had been my grandmother Rose's engagement ring. Oval sapphire, seed pearls, antique gold setting. She wore it for 47 years until her knuckles changed and the ring would no longer pass over them comfortably. She put it in a small velvet box and kept it in her dresser, and sometimes I would find her holding it when I visited, just turning it in her fingers, not sad exactly, just in the specific conversation that people have with objects that have witnessed their whole lives. When she passed, she left me 3 things. A letter I have read so many times the paper has softened along the folds. A quilt. And the ring. She wrote in the letter that she was giving the ring to me because I was the one who would understand what to do with it. For 6 years I kept it exactly as she left it. In the velvet box, in my drawer, taken out sometimes and held and put back. I was not waiting for the right man to give it to. I was not saving it for an engagement. It was mine and it was hers, and the 2 things were not in conflict. And then I met Marcus. And 3 years in, on a night when the apartment was quiet and we had been talking about the future with the ease of people who are no longer afraid of it, I went and got the box. I put it in his hands. I told him about my grandmother. I watched him hold it with the kind of care that made my chest loosen with relief, the relief of having given something precious to someone who understood its weight. He asked me what it meant that I was giving it to him. I said it meant I was serious. That I was not guessing about this anymore. That I wanted him to have it as proof of my intention. He held it for a long time. He said he understood what it meant. He said he would protect it. 4 months later he told me it was lost. Tuesday evening. He came in and sat down, and his face had the specific arrangement of someone who has been rehearsing a conversation. He said he thought it had slipped out of his jacket pocket. He had looked everywhere. He was devastated. He was so sorry. He would spend the rest of his life making this right if I let him. He cried. Not performed crying, real tears, the kind that come from somewhere genuine, and I sat there and I absorbed his grief and I added it to my own, and I believed every word because I had no architecture yet for understanding that a person could cry real tears over a lie. I grieved that ring for 6 months. Then Marcus ended the relationship. By text. A long careful text about not being fully present, about caring but not in the right way, about hoping I understood. I did not understand. But I was too devastated to investigate. I packed the confusion away with the grief and I moved forward because moving forward was the only direction available. 14 months passed. I rebuilt. I returned to myself in the slow, unglamorous way that actual healing works, not a transformation, just a gradual reclaiming of ordinary life. I stopped looking at his social media. I stopped running the relationship through my mind looking for the thing I had missed. I was, by February, genuinely living in my own present tense. And then Claudette called me at 7:30 on Valentine's Day. Claudette had been my friend since before Marcus. She was at Valentino's for a birthday dinner. Marcus was there. With a woman. On one knee. And the ring in the box, She said, she described it and then she stopped describing it because she could hear from my silence that she did not need to describe it further. Oval sapphire. Seed pearls. Antique gold. I told her to stay at the table. I got my keys. The drive was 12 minutes. I have been asked many times since whether I should have waited, whether I should have found a quieter way to handle it, whether bursting into a restaurant on Valentine's Day was proportionate to the situation. Here is what was in my head for those 12 minutes. My grandmother's hands. The velvet box. The night I placed it in Marcus's palms and watched him understand the weight of what he was holding. His tears on a Tuesday evening over a ring he had not lost. 14 months of my grief over something that had been in a drawer somewhere the entire time, waiting to be used on someone else's finger. I was not thinking about proportionate. I was thinking about my grandmother's name on the inside of that band. I walked into Valentino's at 7:49. I saw them immediately. He was still on one knee. She was crying, the good kind, the kind that comes from being overwhelmed by something you believed was only happiness. The room was warm with collective witnessing, that specific restaurant energy when a proposal is happening and everyone has silently agreed to be part of it. I walked toward the table. Claudette saw me coming. Her face went completely still. I stopped 6 feet away and I said one word. Stop. The room dropped into silence so complete I could hear the candle on their table. He turned. He looked at me. And before I said another word, before I pointed at the box or named the ring or told a single person in that restaurant what they were actually witnessing, his face told the whole story. Guilt. Immediate. Total. The guilt of a man who has just watched the thing he believed he had successfully buried walk through a restaurant door and stop 6 feet from his secret. I looked at the ring. I looked at him. And I said, that ring belonged to my grandmother. And you told me it was lost. The woman looked at the ring. Then at me. Then at Marcus. And Marcus, still holding the box, still half crouched from rising off one knee, said absolutely nothing. In front of everyone in that restaurant, with the room completely silent and every eye on him, he said nothing. And his silence was the most complete confession any courtroom could have asked for. I held out my hand. He gave me the ring. And I walked out of Valentino's with my grandmother's ring in my closed fist and 14 months of a lie finally finished. But what happened after I walked out, what I found out in the days that followed, what the full timeline revealed once I had the ring back and the silence to think clearly, that is the part that changed everything I thought I understood about how long the lie had actually been running. And that part is so much worse than a stolen ring. I stood in the parking lot and I opened my fist and I looked at the ring in the orange glow of the street light above me. 47 years on my grandmother's hand. 6 years in my drawer. One night passed between my palms and his. 14 months in whatever drawer he had been keeping it in while I grieved it. And now back. Just like that. Returned in 30 seconds in the middle of a restaurant because there was no other move available to him. Claudette came out 2 minutes after me. She did not say anything. She just stood next to me the way that real friends stand next to you when the situation has not yet resolved itself into something that words can reach. After a while she said, "How long do you think he had it planned?" I told her I did not know yet. She said, "You're going to find out." She was right. The first piece came from someone I had not spoken to in over a year. A woman named Bria who had been adjacent to Marcus's social world during our relationship, not a close mutual friend, more of a recurring presence at the same gatherings. She messaged me the morning after Valentine's Day. She said she had heard what happened at the restaurant and she needed to tell me something she had been holding for a long time and was tired of holding. She told me she had seen Marcus with a woman from the restaurant, whose name was Simone, at an event in October. Not October of this year. October of the year we were still together. I read that message 3 times. October of the year we were still together was 4 months before he told me the ring was lost. Which meant the ring had not been lost during some innocent moment of carelessness. The ring had been removed deliberately, at a point when he was already building something with someone else, and the lost story had been constructed afterward to explain its disappearance from my life in a way that did not require him to confess where it had actually gone. He had not lost my grandmother's ring. He had taken it. He had looked at the most sacred thing I owned and decided it would be useful for a future that did not include me, and then he had sat across from me and manufactured grief convincing enough that I had added my own grief to his and never questioned the story for 14 months. I sat with that information for a full day before I let myself process it completely. Not because I needed time to believe it but because the full shape of what it meant needed space to become visible. He had been with Simone while he was with me. He had ended our relationship not because he was not fully present, the language from his careful text, but because he had already built enough of another life that he was ready to exit ours. The ring had been the bridge between those two things, taken early, held for the transition, deployed eventually as the centerpiece of a proposal to a woman he had chosen while I was still sleeping in the same bed as the person I believed he was. The second piece came from Simone herself. 10 days after the restaurant, she sent a message through Claudette's birthday dinner friend who had been present that night. Her message was short. She said she had learned the real timeline in the days following Valentine's Day. She said she was sorry for what I had experienced. She said she was glad I had walked into that restaurant. I believed her. The message had the quality of someone who was also processing a significant revision to a story they had believed, someone who had just understood that the relationship she had been building contained a foundation she had not known about. Whatever her situation with Marcus had been, she had not been a knowing participant in what was done to me. I was certain enough of that to respond. I told her none of it was her fault. I told her I hoped she was okay. She said she was glad the ring was back where it belonged. That was the end of our exchange, and it was exactly the right amount. Marcus never contacted me. Not after the restaurant, not in the days or weeks following. Whatever internal processing he was doing it without involving me, which was the correct choice even though it arrived approximately 14 months too late. I did not reach out to him. I had taken everything I needed from that restaurant. The ring. The visible confirmation of the lie. The silence on his face when he had no story left to offer. A private conversation would have given him the opportunity to manage the framing, to offer explanations shaped to produce a more comfortable outcome for himself. I was no longer available to be managed. The response from people who knew what had happened split in a predictable way. There were people who understood immediately and stood firmly in that understanding. There were people who found the public nature of the interruption more available to assess than the theft that had produced it, who said things like there must have been a better way without being able to identify what that way was or how it would have produced the ring's return. There were people who occupied the uncomfortable middle, wanting to validate my grievance and also wanting me to have expressed it somewhere other than a crowded restaurant on Valentine's Day. I listened to all of these responses. I did not spend energy defending the restaurant to people who had already decided the scene was the story. Some people will always find the woman who stood up more visible than the man who stole from her. I understood that before I walked through the door of Valentino's, and I walked through it anyway because the ring was inside and it needed to come home. What I did not expect, and what required its own adjustment, was the grief that arrived about 3 weeks after I had the ring back. Not grief for Marcus, or not primarily. Grief for the version of the 3 years I had believed I was living. Because when you discover that a relationship contains something you did not know about, running parallel to what you thought was the whole story, every memory gets re-examined. Every quiet evening. Every conversation about the future. Every moment that had felt like evidence of something real. I had to sit with the understanding that some of those moments had been real and some of them had been performance, and I had no reliable way to sort which was which anymore. That is a specific kind of loss that has no clean resolution. You simply carry the uncertainty and eventually it becomes familiar enough that it stops being the loudest thing in the room. I have not reset the ring. I have not had it altered or repurposed or made into something that erases what it was before. It is back in the velvet box, in the drawer of my nightstand, in the place it occupied for 6 years before I gave it away. I take it out sometimes. I hold it. I put it back. My grandmother gave it to me because she said I was the one who would understand what to do with it, and I am still figuring out what that means for the next chapter, and I am not in a hurry to decide. It is mine. Fully and finally mine again. The question of what happens to it next belongs only to me, and I am comfortable in that ownership in a way I have not been for 14 months. What I return to most often, in the quieter moments of the life I am now living, is the night I gave it to him. I have examined that memory from every angle looking for what I missed, what the evidence was that I failed to read, where the moment was that I should have known. I have not found it. And I have made peace with not finding it, because the decision to trust someone completely, to hand them the most sacred thing you own as proof of your intention, is not a failure even when the person receiving it turns out to be unworthy. The failure was his. The capacity for that kind of trust is mine, and it remains mine, and it did not leave with the ring when he took it. He was on one knee in Valentino's on Valentine's Day, and the ring in that box had my grandmother's name on the inside, and he had told me it was lost, and I walked through that door and said stop, and the room went quiet, and he turned and his face said everything before I said a word. I took back what was mine. I walked out into a parking lot and stood under a streetlight and opened my hand and looked at 47 years of my grandmother's life sitting in my palm, returned from a lie, home from wherever it had been kept while I grieved it. She gave it to me because she said I was the one who understood that objects carry love across time like a current. She was right. The ring carried it through everything. Through the taking and the lie and the 14 months and the restaurant. It carried it all the way back to my hand. Some things cannot be stolen. Not really. Not permanently. They just take the long way home.